Hey guys, it's Nigel here, and I'm here in the workshop today with my beloved 180SX drift car. I'm preparing it for a few drift events that are coming up, which I'm excited about. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to take a closer look at the car and show you around some of the details. Firstly, I want to explain a little about how this car came to be. It is a drift car, and I fell in love with drifting in the early 2000s, as you can tell by the style. Drifting in Japan really opened my eyes up to what was possible with a car, and obviously drifting was very early in its infancy here in Australia. I started drifting in 2002 or 2003. As soon as I got my license, and went to a lot of events, ended up winning a bunch, and I was competing in a black 180SX at that stage. It was very lightly modified. It had a T25 turbo, and I went way too far with the modifications on that, and it started to become a real handful to drive. So I just wanted to get back to the simple life, and ended up purchasing my two-tone S13, which had a turbo SR20 in it at that stage. And I started doing more and more competitive drifting. It started getting pretty rough. The rear quarters were all caved in, and this wasn't something that I'd planned for that car. The idea came about to purchase this car in around 2008, and I went about trying to keep things very simple with this car, but performing all of the fabrication modifications that I know and love to be able to make it perform at a higher level than some of my other competitors. So the early 2000s style still sticks with this car, and this is something that I'll keep forever. And this requires a very low ride height, and as we'll see underneath the car, I've done a whole lot of fabrication modifications to be able to competitively drift at this height, still regain a bunch of grip, and have a car that handles really nicely at the same time. So first up, let's jump into the engine bay and check out the original SR20 that came with this car from 1991. So sitting here in the engine bay, this is a factory Nissan SR20 2-litre turbocharged inline 4-cylinder. I've done some additions to the internals of the motor. I took the head off. I put a 1.2mm multi-layer head gasket on it. I put some ARP head studs just to clamp the whole lot down. And then in the head, I put some Step 1 HKS cams. And being Step 1, they still use the hydraulic lifters. And then on the dyno, we've tuned in some adjustable cam gears to give it some really nice mid-range torque. A lot of that mid-range comes from the TD06 turbo that sits on the hot side. This is a Truss TD06 3-bolt turbo with a 8cm rear housing. And this is a very small rear housing that gives the SR20 a lot of that mid-range. And I really like this turbo because it simplifies everything, as it doesn't need water cooling, and it gives the SR20 a really good punch in the mid-range, which is perfect for drifting. On the inlet side of the motor, we've got some 550cc injectors supplying fuel from a R33 GDR fuel pump in the tank. And this has an upgraded fuel pressure regulator to increase the pressure. And then this is fed through a fuel rail, obviously, that's mounted to a Hypertune intake manifold. And this intake manifold was changed just to, again, simplify things in the engine bay and make it a lot easier to work on. It creates a lot of room under the inlet manifold, and it keeps the motor looking really nice and simple. So the intercooler is 120mm thick, it's 600mm long and 200mm tall. So this is quite a small intercooler, but it really suits the punchiness of the TD06 turbo, and again is really suited to the low boost that this is running, and the suitability that it has for the style of drifting that I wanted to do with this car. This smaller size intercooler gives the dual core aluminium radiator a lot more air than one would with a large intercooler, and this means that the motor runs nice and cool. It runs the original clutch fan with the original shroud, so it gets heaps of air pulled through it, and I've never had any overheating issues with this. I run a header tank or a bleed tank, and this basically just creates a higher point as a fill point in the radiator system, and it's easier to get any air bubbles out. Other notable additions in the engine bay, it runs an oil cooler. Again, this is fitted to just make sure that the motor retains a nice healthy life and oil temps don't get too high. I could monitor these via the DEFI gauges inside, which we'll take a look at soon. And then the ECU side of things is controlled by a Apexy Power FC computer. So all of these modifications make a really reliable 255 rear wheel kilowatts, and this is a really punchy, mid-range, torquey 255 rear wheel kilowatts. So the car feels really fast, it's fun to drive, it's really nice to drift with, and it's been proven to be very, very reliable over the years. The fabrication modifications that I've made to the engine bay largely revolve around creating enough room for the wheels to swing with the amount of lock that it has. So these are upgraded inner wheel well fenders, and these weld to the original strut tops, and then they're braced back to the strut tops with some dimple die brackets, and then created some aluminium ducting to bring all of the air into the coolers. One thing you will notice with the turbocharger on this car is the exhaust housing is actually welded to the mild steel exhaust manifold. These heat up and stretch the 3 bolts and then blow the gasket out. And this is a problem that a lot of people have, and I remedied this by TIG welding the exhaust housing to the manifold just to create a nice strong seal. So when I need to remove the turbo, I just take off the V-band clamp and remove the core of the turbo out of the exhaust manifold. And then on the back of the housing, I've also welded an adapter so that it has a V-band clamp that mounts a 3-inch exhaust that runs all the way out the back unmuffled. Inside the cabin here, it's quite a nice place to be, sitting in the lineup at a drift event. We have a pair of Bride fixed back seats. These are on Bride rails. I'm strapped in with a HPI 4-point harness, and then I work a Nardi 80mm dished wheel with a quick removable boss. The shifter here you'll see is an outboard shifter arrangement, and this is due to the RB25 transmission. So this is a Skyline transmission, and I've adapted it to the SR20. It's a lot stronger, but it does unfortunately have the shifter in a different location. So I've welded on a rose joint mount to the transmission tunnel, and then made up a shifter with an adjustable mount so that I can change the feel of the shift if I need to. And this just suits my driving position and the way that the gearbox mounts into the car. The transmission tunnel is raised up to allow working on the motor and the transmission a lot easier, and this just required me to make a new one out of sheet metal and weld it into the car. You'll see the lever here at the front, and that is a handbrake lever. So we've got 2 handbrakes. We've got the stock one, which is used for loading and parking, and then we've got the hydraulic one, which is used for drifting. So this is plumbed in line with the stock rear brake line, and this does give some feedback to the foot pedal, but I don't mind it, and it works flawlessly, and I've never had an issue with it. Up the front here we have the Apexy Power FC Commander, and this is a hand unit that tells you a few details about the motor. Again, it's pretty archaic, but it sort of suits the style and the era of the car. The gauges that I'm running are DEFI gauges, and this just tells me the boost, the oil pressure, the water temperature, and the oil temperature. And then we've got the controller there as well. The roll cage in the car is a 6-point roll cage, so we've got 4 points in the back with a cross brace, and then we've got 2 door intrusions. In the back here you can see the roll cage a little clearer, and all of the spot welding that I've done to all of the seams. In terms of fabrication, I actually went ahead and cut out the rear strut tops on this car. This is similar to my two-tone S13 as well. This was to raise the coilovers up into the car, not only to lower it, but to reduce the amount of droop that these have. This puts the suspension in the range where I need it, and it also allows for faster tyre changes, as you're not having to lift the car up too much because of the reduced amount of droop. So let's run over some of the Aero items that are on the car. The front bumper bar is a reproduction fiberglass copy of a Type X bumper. This has got some added cutouts on it and also some carbon canards that I've bolted to the side. It's not in the greatest shape. It's been broken apart and glued back together many times. The front fenders are actually stock metal items, and these are made possible because of the wheel and tyre setup, which I'll get to soon. The bonnet is a vented M Sports fiberglass bonnet. The side skirts here are stock Type X plastic ones. The rear guards are 50mm fiberglass Origin items. It has a roof wing, also from Origin, and this is made out of carbon fibre. And then we have some vortex generators at the rear that are mounted onto the Type X plastic rear pods, and then it has a Type X plastic rear centre garnish, along with the factory rear bumper bar and a Type X rear wing. The tail lights are also from the later model Type X 180SX. The mirrors are from East Bear, and these fit the S13 chassis really nicely. The wheel and tyre combo that I'm running here is a set of original TE37s in bronze, and these measure 17x9 front and 18x10.5 in the back. So we have an offset of 0 here in the front and plus 22 in the back. And I'm running a 25mm spacer in the rear, and then I run a 15mm spacer on the front. The tyres, I have a 215/40/17 RT615K Plus Falcon tyre here in the front, and then I have a 235/40/18 in the rear, also Falcon RT615K Plus. In behind the wheel here we have Z32 aluminium 4-pot calipers, braided brake lines, Teen Super Drift coilovers. I've extended the lower control arms 15mm, and I also have fitted Kazama caster rods and then strengthened tie rods and tie rod ends, and these connect onto the knuckle, and I've actually cut and shut the knuckle so that it has a reduced amount of Ackerman, which means that both wheels are pointing in the right direction for drifting. And then also reduce the length on the steering arms so that I have a quicker response behind the steering wheel. In behind the wheel here we have adjustable arms to correct the alignment for drifting at this height. We have our coilovers, and then we have a Nismo two-way clutch pack type LSD that locks the wheels under acceleration and deceleration, which is needed when drifting. One of the interesting items under here is the subframe. I've actually raised this up into the car as much as I can. I've notched a lot of the chassis rail and bits and pieces in here to try and lift the subframe and align all of the arms to drift very low. And this is something that I've tried to do with this car, is to keep all of the parts factory bolt-on items so that they're easily sourced, but then raise them all up into the car so that I can drift at the height that I want to, but maintain correct geometry. So that about wraps up the tour of my 180SX. Throughout this video, I've tried to explain the ethos behind the build, and that is just having a good time driving, enjoying drifting, styling the car on what I love about drifting, and that is, I guess, the early 2000s era. And this car I've had a whole bunch of fun in, and the whole ethos behind the build has really been to have seat time, to enjoy driving, and to only replace the things that have been broken, and try and keep the car at a constant level so that when I jump into it, doesn't matter how long it's been, I know what it's going to do, I know what it needs, I know how to drive it, and then if anything needs replacing, then it's quite easy to do so. There are a lot of one-off fabricated items on this car, but most of them use bolt-on parts, and that's all because I want to be able to get back out there if I break something quite easily, if I'm not home and I can't fabricate things on the go. So it's been a real balancing act to try and not fabricate everything on this car, but to try and bolt on items that I know are available, and then keep it so that it's reliable, I can drive it, and I can also repair it at the track easily. I've had some incredibly fun times behind the wheel of this car, and I'll continue to do so into the future. So thanks for taking the time to watch this tour.